We continue now at the top of Daf Pei Beis Amud Beis in Meseches Bava Basra. This is Bava Basra Daf 82b. On the previous summit, the Gemara brought the Mishnah which said that if the person buys 3 trees in a property, he acquires not only the 3 trees, but also the land beneath and directly surrounding the 3 trees. And the Gemara asks, how much land surrounding does he get? Meaning the land that's not directly beneath the tree and its branches, how much extra land does he get? And the Gemara here continues, Kimolo Ora Vasalo, it's the amount of space for the gatherer and his basket. That's talking about the gatherer, let's say, of the figs, and his basket. He needs a little bit of that space around the trees. And the Gemara continues, Ma'askef lo Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Elazar asks on this, Hashta derech ein lo. In this case, now we're saying that he doesn't get a path to his trees. Let's say a person buys 3 trees, so we understand he gets some land that's right under the tree, but he doesn't have a path in the seller's property to get to his trees. And yet, Ora Vasalo Yeshlo, you're giving him the area where he can stand outside of the trees, the area for the gatherer and his basket, that he gets, meaning if he's already not getting a path to the trees, which is critical, absolutely critical to be able to get there, but he doesn't get that, that's not part of his purchase, why should he get Ora Vasala? Why should he get an area around the trees in order to have for gathering and for his basket? That wouldn't make any sense to give him that land if he doesn't have a derech. And the Gemara continues and explains, derech ein lo, he doesn't have a path to get to the tree, da'ara achrisi, because this is land that belongs to somebody else. He's buying 3 trees within someone's property. So again, that's the Gemara's question, Ora Vasalo Yeshlo, you're going to give him the amount of space for the gatherer and his basket. That doesn't make sense. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rabbi Zera says, Midivrei Rabbeinu nilmad, from the words of our Rebbe, meaning from the words of Rabbi Elazar, we can learn, Shloshahu de'ein lo derech, that only when a person buys 3 trees in a property, where he does get the land directly beneath the trees, so there, he doesn't also acquire a path to the trees. Hashnayim yeshlo, but let's say a person would just buy 2 trees where he gets no property whatsoever, so there actually he would acquire a path to get to the 2 trees. Di'amarle, because he can say to him, Bi'ara didach kaimi, they're in your land, meaning I have trees that are in your land, how am I going to get there? It must be that I have a path as well. And the Rashbam explains, Kimelo Ora Vasalo, again, that's the amount of space for the gatherer and his basket. Achutz lehen kai, this is going on the land that surrounds the trees that he is getting. Ora shayach l'meimra b'ta'enim. The Rashbam explains that the word Ora is used by a gatherer by figs. Ubotzer ba'navim, v'kotzer b'tvua, v'goder b'tmarim. You use different words by different kinds of fruits. By grapes, you use the word botzer. By tvua, you use kotzer. By tamarim, you use goder. Umosek b'zeisim. By olives, you use mosek. Umalaket b'shari lonos. By all other kinds of trees, you use the word malak. Maskef lo Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Elazar asks, Rabbi Yochanan, do yoiv le derech chutza lehen kemelo ora v'salo? According to Rabbi Yochanan, who just said that you get an area around the trees, the amount for the gatherer and his basket, kedei lahalech sevivos ha'ilanos, in order to walk around the trees, lelaket peirosav, to collect its fruits. So hashta, so the question is now, derech ein lo, he doesn't have a path, likones derech sadeu shel baal sadeh, he's not allowed to enter through the field of the owner of the field, leilech leilonosav, to go to his trees. So what do we say? How does he get to his trees? El yifrach ba'aver, he either has to fly in the air, so to speak, or yikach lo derech mibal hakarka, or he's going to have to purchase the rights to a path from the owner of the land. Ki rabbanan dehamocher es habayis, that follows the rabbanan earlier in parak hamocher es habayis, the amri gavi mocher bor v'dos ba'ayin ra mocher. They say that when a person sells a pit or a cistern, he sells not generously, v'tzarach likach lo derech, and the buyer therefore has to purchase the rights to a path, lebora ledoso, to get to his pit, to get to his cistern. V'hu adin hach, and the same thing is true over here. Gavi shloshi lanos, by the case of buying 3 trees, didami lebor v'dos, that's similar to buying a pit or a cistern, mishum da'ara achrisihi, this is another person's land, meaning she'ein ha'ilanos netuin bekarka shel bal hasadeh. The point over here is that the trees are not planted in the land of the owner of the field. Sharei yesh lehen karka, because they do have land, meaning when you buy 3 trees, you do get the land directly underneath the trees. So you have a situation essentially of 2 properties. You have one property, which is the owner of the 3 trees and the land beneath the 3 trees, and then you have the owner of the field in general. The 3 trees are considered to be their own orchard, independent. Dumya de bor v'dos, that's similar to a pit and a cistern. Shukarka b'fnei atzmo, that's its own land. And so therefore, the seller's property, there's no rights that the buyer has to the seller's property for his trees. Because if he did have rights, then you could say whatever is needed, he has those rights. Even to give him a path, like we're about to say, by 2 trees. meaning to say that's the difference between two trees and 3 trees. By 3 trees, so it's really 2 separate properties. And so you have no rights, you as a buyer have no rights to the seller's property. That's a different property. But in a case where a person buys 2 trees, where he gets no land with those trees, so now he automatically has to have some rights to the property of the seller because he has trees on the property of the seller, and those rights could include a path as well. Kimelo ora v'salo, again, this is a continuation of the question, how come you're giving him this amount of space for the picker and the basket? She'ein tzarech lo kol kach, he doesn't even need that as much, kemo derech, like a path. A path to the trees is much more needed than just some extra space around the trees just to be able to harvest conveniently from the trees. Yeshlo, that he gets kimelo ora v'salo, even though he has no path. But Tmiya, the Gemara is asking this as a question. Harayevsher lalos be'ilan v'lilkot, you could always climb a tree and pick. You don't need to have an extra space around. Inami mitachtav yilakit, you can always collect from right underneath the branches. And so then the Gemara said, Midivrei Rabbeinu, we learn from the words of our Rebbe, meaning Rebbe Lozer, Shapiresh Taimum Mishum Da'arach Risi, because Rebbe Lozer has said that the reason why you don't get a path is because that's somebody else's property. There are 2 properties over here, as we said. Hashnayim Yeshlo, so we can understand that, let's say he just bought 2 trees, he actually would get a derech, he would get a path, Da'ain Lo Karka, because there he has no land, and so when he has no land whatsoever, it's actually more beneficial in that sense. Because then already the buyer can say that my trees are on your property. So clearly you've given me some rights to your land for the trees. Like a person who lends some space in his house to his friend, to place his objects there. Over here also, he's obviously lending him some rights by 2 trees, and then he would in fact get a path. And the Gemara continues, Amar le Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak l'Rava, Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says to Rava, Leimer Rebbe Lozer les le de Shmuel Rabbi. Let us say that Rebbe Lozer does not hold of what his Rebbe Shmuel holds. The Amar Shmuel, because Shmuel says, Halacha Rebbe Akiva, the halacha is like Rebbe Akiva. The Amar Mocher b'ayin yafa mocher. Rebbe Akiva says that when a person sells, he sells generously. In other words, Rebbe Lozer over here is saying that when a person buys 3 trees, he does not acquire a path to those trees from the seller. And so it seems that the seller is not selling generously. And that does not seem to be like Shmuel, because Shmuel holds like Rabbi Akiva, that a seller does sell generously. And the Gemara answers, Amar Lei said back to him, Lo mesukma masnisin Rabbi Akiva. Actually, Rebbe Lozer himself might hold like Shmuel, and Rebbe Lozer himself might hold that a seller sells generously. Rebbe Lozer is just saying that it cannot be that the Mishnah is following Rabbi Akiva. Mimai, and how do we know that's the case? Midiktani, because what does it say in the Mishnah by a person who buys 3 trees? It says Higdilu Yeshaf. It says, let's say the trees grow, they extend beyond, the branches extend beyond normal. So then the seller is allowed to cut those branches. He's allowed to trim those branches. Now, if you think that our Mishnah is Rabbi Akiva, Ma Yeshafa, why would the seller be allowed to trim the branches? Ha'amar mocher b'ayin yafa mocher, but Rabbi Akiva says that the seller sells generously, and so he shouldn't be cutting the branches. The buyer should get a generous amount, and the buyer should be allowed to have his branches be overgrown, and so therefore you see, that's what Rebbe Lozer says, therefore you see that the Mishnah cannot be Rabbi Akiva. But the Gemara continues, Amar Lei said to him, Eimor de Amar Rabbi Akiva. Now I understand Rabbi Akiva says his halacha, Gabe bor v'dos. In other words, Rabbi Akiva, when he says that a seller sells generously, that could be a situation by selling a pit or a cistern. The lo mekachshi are there, they're not weakening the ground at all. Meaning to say, when the seller sells to the buyer, let's say the pit or the cistern are not causing any damage to the seller's property at all. And so therefore, in that case, he sells generously. He gives him rights to the derech as well, to the bor and the dos. But gabe ilon mishamatale, but let's say by a tree, do we really know that Rabbi Akiva would even say that? In other words, we're suggesting over here that Rebbe Lozer and our Mishnah is not following Rabbi Akiva, and that's why he doesn't get a path, because Rabbi Akiva says that a seller sells generously and does give a path. But we can really make a distinction between selling trees and selling a bor v'dos. When it comes to selling a bor v'dos, there's no damage that the bor and the dos are causing to the land, and therefore the seller is generous in giving the bor and the dos. But when it comes to the trees, there's a certain amount of damage that the trees can do to the land, and so then maybe it would make sense to say that the seller is not as generous. As the Gemara continues, Milo Modi Rabbi Akiva, wouldn't Rabbi Akiva admit, Be'ilan hanota l'soch sadeh chavero, in general, if you have a tree that's hanging over into the neighbor's field, shekotze, it's moli mardeya me'al gavi machresha, that he's allowed to cut the amount of an ox goad, meaning to say, to give the person enough space that he's able to plow, he'd be able to cut the overhanging branches. And so therefore the same thing should be true over here. In this particular case, even if the Mishnah was following Rabbi Akiva, that a seller sells generously, generously, but you don't have to expect that the seller has to allow the branches to overhang and cause him damage. Certainly if there's a situation of damage, the seller would not be as generous, and therefore you can even suggest over here that Rebbe Elazar is following Rabbi Akiva and asking his question, but our Mishnah is different because again it's talking about a situation where it could be damaging. And the Rashbam explains, the Milo Modi Rabbi Akiva, doesn't Rabbi Akiva admit, again, that if a tree is overhanging into a neighbor's property, the neighbor is allowed to cut the branches. This is the case in Lo Yachbor. Again, you have a tree that's hanging into the neighbor's property. And so the Rashbam explains here also in our case, when a person is buying 3 trees, lahu dami, it's similar to that case as well. If the trees overgrow, so then we say the seller is allowed to trim the branches. Again, these trees are not planted in the land of the seller because the buyer got some land as well. They have their own land over here. And so therefore it's 2 separate properties completely. And so therefore the Gemara essentially is saying at this point that the Mishnah could be following Rabbi Akiva, that a seller sells generously. Rabbi Akiva would say that he does get the shear of Ora V'Salo. He will get that land for the gatherer in his basket, because according to Rabbi Akiva, the seller sells generously and he does give a path, similar to the case of bor and dos. You can't compare just a little bit of space of Ora V'Salo to the same as a big damage that can happen when a tree is overhanging into a neighbor's property. And then according to this, the Gemara is saying that it comes out that Rebbe Elazar does not hold of Shmuel. That's why Rebbe Elazar is asking the question and saying, if the person's not even going to get a path to the trees, why should you give him Ora V'Salo? That essentially is Rebbe Elazar's question on the explanation that he gets that much land. And the Gemara continues, Tanya Kevasid Rebbe Chia bar Abba. We have a brisa that supports Rebbe Chia bar Abba, meaning despite the question of Rebbe Elazar on Rebbe Chia bar Abba, we do have a brisa that supports him. The person who buys 3 trees, he gets the land beneath the trees and between the trees, and also outside of the trees, the amount for the gatherer and his basket. And the Gemara continues, Amarle Abaye Rav Yosef. Abaye said to Rav Yosef, Osan Ora V'Salo, that land that's given to the owner of the trees, the amount of space for the gatherer in his basket, Mizoran, who's allowed to plant that land? Who's allowed to put seeds in that land? Is the buyer allowed to plant over there? Or is the seller allowed to plant over there? Amarle said to him, Tanisui, we learned it in a Mishnah later on, Hachitzon Zoreas Haderech. There's a case where a person has a garden on the inside, another person has on the outside, and the person on the inside, he gets a path through the garden of the outside, but that person on the outside is allowed to plant along that path. And so therefore over here as well, the seller should be allowed to plant this area of Ora V'Salo. And the Gemara continues, Amar Lei said back to him, Ami Dami, can you really compare our case to that Mishnah later on? Hasam les leipsei de l'lokeach. Over there's no loss for the buyer. If he plants on the path, the buyer still can essentially walk through the path. It doesn't really impede the buyer. That's why he's allowed to plant over there. But over here, if he plants in this area where the person is going to stand around his trees, so is leipsei de l'lokeach, there actually will be a loss for the buyer. Because he can say to him, Kamitanfi Pirni, my fruits, they're being ruined when they fall into a planted area. They get dirtier, they are ruined more, and therefore represents a loss. So it wouldn't be the same thing to allow the seller to plant in this area. And the Gemara continues, Halo Damya El Seif. If you're going to compare our case to the later Mishnah, it should be to the end of that later Mishnah, where there was a case over there of Vizeh Einon Rashayin Lazor. There's a case over there where we say that they're not allowed to plant because it is considered a little bit of an impediment to the buyer, and the same thing should be true over here. And the Gemara continues, Tanya Kavase de Abaya. We have a brisa that supports Abaya. The brisa says, Hareza Kana Tachteinu Venein V'chutz Lehen Kimlo Ora V'Salo. Again, a person buys 3 trees, he gets the land beneath them and between them and outside of them, the amount of the gatherer in his basket. V'zeh Einon Rashayin Lazor. And both of them are not allowed Lazora, they're not allowed to plant in the area. Again, that's like Abaya said, that you shouldn't be allowed to plant if it's doing some damage to the buyer. And the Gemara continues, V'kama yehe beinei, how much space can be between the 3 trees? We said that if a person buys 3 trees, so then he's entitled to this land between them, but obviously the 3 trees cannot be too far away from each other, or else they won't be considered to be one unit, so how close to each other do they have to be? Rav Yosef Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Rav Yosef says that Rav Yehuda says that Shmuel says, Me arba amos v'ad shmon. It has to be between 4 and 8 amos away from each other. other can't be more than 8 amos away. Rava Amar Rav Nachman Amar Shmuel. Rava says that Rav Nachman says that Shmuel says Mishmo Naviat Sheish Esrei. It's actually from 8 amos until 16 amos, but it can't be more than 16 amos away, or else it's not considered to be one unit. Amar Le Abaye Le Rav Yosef. Abaye said to Rav Yosef, Lo tiflo galea to Rav Nachman. Don't argue on Rav Nachman. Really, the amount, the distance between the trees is 16 amos. How do we know that Rav Nachman is correct that it's 16 amos? The Tanan Masnisim Kivase, because we have a Mishnah that supports him. The Tanan, as we learned in a Mishnah, Hanoteas Karmo, if a person plants his vineyard, Sheish Esrei Amal, Sheish Esrei Aman, it's 16 amos by 16 amos. Mutter Lahavi Zer Lasham, once it's that distance, one row from the other, if you have 16 amos between them already, so then you can have other plants in the in-between area, in that area, because it's not considered to be one unit. It's not considered to be a kerem, which would have a prohibition of planting kilayim, of planting different species. Amar Rav Yehuda says, Ma'aseh b'Salmon, there was an incident in Salmon, be'echad shanatas karmo sheish esrei al sheish esrei amma. There was a person who planted his vineyard exactly this way, 16 amos by 16 amos. V'ayahofech sa'ar shtei shuros l'tzad echad. He would turn the branches of the two rows to one side, v'zoreya es hanir, and then he would plant in the empty space between them. And then l'shana acheres, and then the next year, hayahofech es ha'sa'ar l'makom hazera. He would turn the branches back the other direction towards where he planted the previous year, v'zor es habor, and he would plant the empty space on the other side. In other words, he would always face the branches in the direction towards the row where he was not going to plant. In that way, it was a barren area, and it wasn't considered a problem of planting kilayim. This incident came before the Chacham. They said that is permitted, and in any case, you see from here that the distance seems to be 16 amos, and that's why Abaye is asking on Rav Yosef, how can you say the distance is 8 amos? It seems from this Mishnah, like Rav Nachman, that the distance is 16 amos. Amar Lei, so he said back to him, Rav Yosef said back to Abaye, Anolo Yadan, I don't know, Elo Uvdahav, I just know that there was a case like this, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Pei Gimel Amud Aleph.